Book 2, The Island Adventures, Chapter 10 of The Book of Missionary Heroes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. The Book of Missionary Heroes by Basil Mathews. Chapter 10. The Arrows of Santa Cruz. Bishop Pattison. Date of Incident: August 15th, 1864. The brown crew of the Southern Cross breathed freely again as the anchor swung into place, and the schooner began to nose her way out into the open Pacific. They were hardened to dangers, but the island of tawny cannibals had strained their nerve by its hourly perils from club and flying arrow. The men were glad to see their ship's bows plunge freely again through the long-backed rollers. As they set her course to the island of Santa Cruz, the crew talked together of the men of the island they had left. In his cabin sat a great bronzed, bearded man, writing a letter to his own people, far away on the other side of the world. Here are the very words that he wrote as he told the story of one of the dangers through which they had just passed on the island. As I sat on the beach with a crowd about me, most of them suddenly jumped up and ran off. Turning my head, I saw a man, from the boat they saw too, coming to me with club uplifted. I remained sitting and held out a few fish hooks to him, but one or two men jumped up, and seizing him by the waist, forced him off. After a few minutes I went back to the boat. I found out that a poor fellow called Molitium was shot dead 2 months ago by a white trader for stealing a bit of calico. The wonder was, not that they wanted to avenge the death of their kinsman, but that others should have prevented it. How could they possibly know that I was not one of the wicked set? Yet they did. The plan of going among the people unarmed makes them regard me as a friend. Then he says of these men who had just tried to kill him, "The people, though constantly fighting, and cannibals and the rest of it, are to me very attractive." The ship sailed on till they heard ahead of them the beating of the surf on the reef of Santa Cruz. Behind the silver line of the breakers the waving fronds of her palms came into sight. They put the Southern Cross in, cast anchor, and let a boat down from her side. Into the boat tumbled a British sailor named Pierce, a young 20-year-old Englishman named Atkin, and 3 brown South Sea Island boys from the Missionary Training College for native teachers on Norfolk Island, and their leader, Bishop Pattison, the white man who, having faced the clubs of savages on a score of islands, never flinched from walking into peril again to lead them to know of the best man in the world, Jesus Christ. These brown boys were young helpers of Bishop Pattison, and one of them especially, Fisher Young, would have died for his great white leader gladly. They were like father and son. The reef, covered at mid-tide with curling waters mottled with the foam of the broken waves, was alive with men, while the beach beyond was black with crowds of the wild islanders who had come down to see the strange visitors from the ship. The 4 men sculled the boat on to the edge of the reef, and then rested on their oars as Pattison swung himself over the side into the cool water. He waded across the reef between the hosts of savages, and in every hand was a club or spear or a 6-foot wooden bow with an arrow ready to notch in its bamboo string. Pattison had come to make friends with them, so he entered a dark, wattled house and sat down to talk. The doorway was filled with the faces of wondering men. As he looked on them, a strange gleam of longing came into his eyes, and a smile of great tenderness softened the strength of his brown face, the longing and the tenderness of a shepherd looking for wandering sheep who are lost on the wild mountains of the world. Then he rose, left the house, and went back to the boat. The water was now one seething cauldron of men, walking, splashing, swimming. Some, as Pattison climbed into his boat, caught hold of the gunwale and could hardly be made to loosen their hold. The 4 young fellows in the boat swung their oars and got her under way, but they had made barely half a dozen strokes when, without warning, an arrow whizzed through the air into the boat. A cloud of arrows followed. 6 canoes were now filled with savage Santa Cruzans, who surrounded the boat and joined in the shooting. Pattison, who was in the stern between his boys and the bowman, had not shipped the rudder, so he held it up as the boat shot ahead of the canoes to shield off arrows. Turning round to see whither his now rudderless boat was being pulled, he saw that they were heading for a little bay in the reef, which would have wrecked their hopes of safety. "Pull, port oars! Pull on steadily!" shouted Pattison, and they made for the Southern Cross. As he called to them he saw Pierce, the young British sailor, lying between the thwarts with the long shaft of an arrow in his chest, and a young Norfolk Islander with an arrow under his left eye. The arrows flew around them in clouds, and suddenly Fisher Young, the 19-year-old Polynesian whom he loved as a son, who was pulling stroke, gave a faint scream. He was shot through the left wrist. "Look out, sir! Close to you!" cried one of his crew. But the arrows were all around him. All the way to the schooner the canoes skimmed over the water, chasing the boat. The 4 youths, including the wounded, pulled on bravely and steadily. At last they reached the ship and climbed on board, while the canoes, fearing vengeance from the men on the schooner, turned and fled. Once aboard, Bishop Pattison knelt by the side of Pierce, drew out the arrow, which had run more than 5 inches deep into his chest, and bound up his wound. Turning to Fisher, he found that the arrow had gone through the wrist and had broken off in the wound. Taking hold of the point of the arrow where it stood out on the lower side of the wrist, Pattison pulled it through, though the agony of the boy was very great. The arrows were wooden-headed and not poisoned. The wound seemed to be healing, but a few days later Fisher said, "I can't make out what makes my jaws feel so stiff." Fisher Young was the grandson of fierce, foul Pitcairn Island cannibals, and was himself a brave and pure Christian lad. He had faced death with his master many times on coral reefs, in savage villages, on wild seas, and under the clouds of Pacific Islanders. Now he was face to face with something more difficult than a swift and dangerous adventure, the slow, dying agony of lockjaw. He grew steadily worse in spite of everything that Pattison could do. Near to the end he said faintly, "Kiss me. I am very glad I was doing my duty. Tell my father that I was in the path of duty, and he will be so glad. Poor Santa Cruz people." He spoke in that way of the people who had killed him. The young brown hero lies today, as he would have wished, in the port that was named after the bishop whom he loved, and who was his hero, Port Pattison. "I loved him," said Pattison, "as I think I never loved any one else." Fisher's love to his bishop had been that of a youth to the hero whom he worships. But Pattison had led that brown islander still further, for he had taught the boy to love the hero of all heroes, Jesus Christ. End of chapter 10. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.